Alors, sans plus tarder, je veux surtout pas prendre tellement de temps. Je vais vous présenter Len Bowers, qui est à l'Institut psychiatrique de Londres, qui nous vient de Londres et qui était en congrès à Winnipeg. Donc, il a accepté de faire un petit détour par chez nous pour nous parler de la question de l'isolement et de la contention. C'est un spécialiste, en fait, je dirais davantage des conflits. C'est quelqu'un qui s'intéresse beaucoup à la question des conflits, à la dangerosité et aux questions d'isolement et de contention. C'est également un infirmier psychiatrique qui a fait un doctorat par la suite, donc. Voilà. Alors, avant de vous le présenter, je vais quand même laisser Madame Fortin nous dire quelques mots. Et puis ensuite, on va y aller avec la conférence.
Alors, je ne prendrai pas beaucoup de temps, moi non plus, mais je trouve que c'est une chance inespérée d'avoir un conférencier de cette qualité-là sur un thème comme l'isolement, la contention. Je suis Denise Fortin, je suis la directrice générale de l'Institut universitaire en santé mentale. J'ai oublié de me présenter. Donc, cette conférence-là, ça s'inscrit vraiment dans le cadre des travaux qu'on mène et des réflexions qu'on fait autour de la pleine citoyenneté, entre autres, parce que c'est un grand thème, l'isolement, la contention, quand on pense aux droits des gens, à leur liberté, et en même temps à la nécessité de soins. Alors, je trouve que c'est une chance pour nous d'avoir M. Bowers avec nous et nous allons en profiter le plus possible. Merci d'être là.
Thank you very much for your kind welcome and for your offer to host this visit. My thanks to you all for turning up over lunch today to come and hear what I have to say. And my thanks to all of those people in the 15 different destinations where this is being video conferenced to. I can't see you, but I hope you can see me, and I hope you can hear me, or at least hear the translation of what it is that I have to say. Ah, there they all are. Hello, everybody. That's great. Thank you very much. I've been doing some research in acute inpatient psychiatry for about the past 15 or 16 years. I guess the reason that I'm here today is because of the research that was done here and at the Philippe Pinel Institute, locally also in Montreal, that was carried out by Caroline Leroux and by Alexandre Dumais and others. That research surprised me very much, and I will begin to explain to you why that was. Let me first explain to you the topic of my research. So I do research into what I call conflict. These are potentially harmful events. So this would be aggression by psychiatric inpatients, patients who abscond or run away from hospital, medication refusal, self-harm and suicide, all of those things that might lead to harm for patients or for staff. And I also do research into what I call containment. These are all the things that we do in order to try and promote the safety of staff and patients. So they range from the giving of extra medication at the discretion of nurses through to actually coercing intramuscular medication, special observation, seclusion, manual restraint, and time out. The whole aim of my program of research is to try and find a way to reduce both conflict and containment to minimum levels, whilst at the same time keeping patients and staff safer than they are already. And as I say, I've been plugging away at that research now, keeping going with that research for about 15 or 16 years, and I think I am fairly close to having some answers. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the coherence of these two concepts of conflict and containment. Is it legitimate? Is it okay to group all of those very different conflict behaviors together? And is it okay to think about all of those different containment measures together, the seclusion, the manual restraint, and the medication? My research tells me that yes, this is entirely coherent, and in fact it is the right thing to do. There are two reasons for this. The first reason is that these behaviors and these events cluster within patients. So patients who are aggressive are also more likely to abscond and also more likely to refuse medication, etc. And patients who are subject to or given extra medication are also more likely to be secluded, are also more likely to be manually restrained. So they cluster, those behaviors and those events cluster within patients, but they also cluster within wards. So I can go and visit a psychiatric hospital in the UK, and quite often I will see two wards. They are designed exactly the same because they were built at the same time. They sit next to each other. They take for similar patients with similar staff, same staffing levels, same equipment, and yet one of those wards will have 10 times as much conflict and containment as does the other ward. So wards that have high levels of aggression also have high levels of absconding, also have high levels of medication refusal. And wards that use a lot of seclusion and restraint also give out lots of medication. Those things travel together. Similarly, wards that have low rates of conflict also tend to have low rates of containment. These things cluster together, so it's sensible to look at them all together. And that also suggests that there is a common cause or some common causes lying behind all of these different conflict behaviors and all of these different containment events. Please allow me to show you some pictures. These are pictures of different forms of containment, and my purpose in showing you these pictures is to tell you what these events actually look like in the first part, and secondly to just impress upon you how much they vary between different wards, hospitals, and countries. So a manual restraint, as you can see here, I'm being restrained by my team of researchers. We must have been having a very difficult meeting that morning, and I kind of lost my cool a little bit, and I might have shouted at them too much, and they decided to restrain me. So you see, we do specific training for this in the UK, so you have the one person at the head there who is in charge of the team, and the others are using specific holds to restrain me. On similar wards in England, on some wards this happens once every 10 days, but on other wards it can happen every other day. So there's a vast variation in the rates of this in the UK. If you try and compare countries, looking at some other statistics, in London, looking at a London acute psychiatric ward, about 18% of patients are restrained like this during the first 2 weeks of their stay. But in Modena, in Italy, it's 10%. And in Athens, at a large psychiatric hospital there, it's half of patients in the first 2 weeks of their stay. Vast variations. This is seclusion, and here's a picture of a seclusion room. A typical seclusion room in England, quite a strong door. Inside you have a kind of a foam mattress or a bed. Sometimes it's a thinner mattress on the floor, very secure room, no furniture in there, no way for the patient to damage the room or to harm themselves. Within England, this can range from nobody. There are some hospitals where this is not done at all, about a third of our hospitals where there is no use of seclusion. This is in the acute psychiatric sector, including psychiatric intensive care units, no seclusion. And there are other hospitals where up to 25% of patients are secluded. And similarly, if you look at rates in England, this obviously happens never at some places, through to once every 5 days, and that's in a study of 136 different psychiatric wards. If you look at some comparisons between countries, then in Norway, wherever you live in Norway, whichever psychiatric hospital you go to in Norway, you will never be secluded because they don't believe in doing it and they don't use it at all. In the Netherlands, up until quite recently, about 25% of patients across the board were subject to seclusion. And you can see some comparable rates there for London, it's 5% of patients. Modena in Italy, nobody was secluded there. And in Athens, it was about 0.5% of patients. Okay. Here we have coerced intramuscular medication. This is where somebody is injected with tranquilizing drugs against their will. Again, it's me. Obviously, I didn't calm down after the manual restraint. And luckily, my staff had concern for my modesty, and they injected me through my trousers. Okay, within England, that can be 0 to 33% of patients who receive this particular form of treatment. And that's a study of 31 hospitals and 522 patients. It can happen never in the course of a 6-month spell on the ward through to happening every other day. So vast variations in the rates of use of this in the UK. And if you look at the comparison between countries, then at a London psychiatric hospital, that was 16% of patients subject to this. In Modena, Italy, it was 11% of patients. And in Athens, it was a large 38% of patients who were subject to this form of containment. This is mechanical restraint. Here again, I'm being tied to the bed. This was not in England on this occasion because we don't have these in England. We don't use any mechanical restraint whatsoever. So none of this happens in England. This was a picture that was taken in Denmark, where I was being restrained at an international meeting where clearly, again, I have a bit of a temper problem and I need to be managed. I will try to be good today. Okay. If you look at the comparisons between countries, obviously in London this is 0%. Doesn't happen to any of our patients. In Modena in Italy, it happens to 1 in 10 patients. And in Athens, this happened during the first 2 weeks of their stay to half of their patients in the Athens psychiatric hospital. So, seclusion and mechanical restraint. This, in most countries, this never happens. I did not believe, actually, that this could happen. When Caroline Leroux and Alexander Dumais published their research, I had to write to them before I would believe that this actually occurred, and I could not understand why it would be the case. And even now, I'm not absolutely sure until I see it. I've seen it at the Philip Pinnell Hospital, but apparently this occurs here. Caroline, where are you? Are you in the audience somewhere? It really does happen here? Does it? Yeah. So the only other place in the globe, and I have visited many different countries and seen many different psychiatric hospitals, the only other place where I know this happens is in half the hospitals in Germany, where we don't know the rates, and they have some concern about it. But I believe this occurs in all the hospitals in Francophone Canada and involves about 20% or 1 in 5 of the patients. Now, I go around and I talk at a lot of international conferences. I have taken to quite frequently, since the publication of the research from this hospital and the Philip Pinnell Institute, I have taken to presenting this slide and talking about this. At the point at which I tell the audiences that seclusion and mechanical restraint are done together here in Canada, they are shocked and horrified, and it is my responsibility to give you this feedback and tell you this is the way that your actions are regarded from outside. People are shocked and horrified. That's the first thing. Second thing for you to realise is I presented this information in Winnipeg last week to the Registered Psychiatric Nurses Association conference, and they were also shocked, surprised, and had no idea that this was happening over here in Quebec. I don't know whether to tell you, actually, some of the other things that people say to me after this conference. Maybe if you ask me a question afterwards, I'll tell you the other things that people start quizzing me about when I present this. So that's the truth, I'm sorry. How did we end up in the position of not having any mechanical restraint in the UK? I want to tell you a little bit about this story. This is a psychiatric hospital. This is a psychiatric hospital in the UK, which was the Middlesex County Asylum, where this man, John Connolly, instituted a system of non-restraint. In other words, people were regularly restrained at this hospital up until 1839, roundabout. Over a period of 5 years, John Connolly worked with the attendants in this hospital to make sure that there were no further restrained patients, and in order to do that, he trained his attendants in being kind and caring and respectful and communicating with patients, he also brought in the idea of using seclusion as an alternative to using mechanical restraint. Now, he had two sources of inspiration. One was William Tuke at the York Retreat that was also in the UK, who had instituted a psychiatric hospital where restraint was not used. But his main unnamed source of inspiration for doing this at the Middlesex County Asylum was actually Philippe Pinel, and as we know now from the historical record, the importance of Poussin, who was his assistant. Now, you should know more about this story than I know myself. I can't even properly pronounce the names of these hospitals. I'm going to have a go. Bicêtre and Salpêtrière. Yeah, that shows you how bad my French is, sorry. So this commenced the non-restraint movement in the UK, but it took a long time before all restraint was finally gone from UK psychiatric hospitals. The last pieces of mechanical restraint in our hospitals were actually straitjackets. I don't know what the translation of that is. Canvas jackets that hold your arms like this. They all went in the 1930s. It's a little bit difficult to find out exactly when they went, but the only place in the UK where you can see mechanical restraint now is in a museum. So you can never see it in a psychiatric ward. And if you show these pieces of equipment to psychiatric nurses in the UK, then they feel ill. They can't believe that they would actually still be in use. Okay, so that's mechanical restraint. Now talking about seclusion, you'll remember I've already told you that about a third of the hospitals in UK don't use seclusion. How did we actually arrive at this position? Well, it wasn't through research, and it wasn't because we had some specific intervention that we used. If you look at all of our hospitals, then you find that, those that were built a long time ago are more likely to have access to a seclusion room. So those built before 1959, 73% of those hospitals actually have seclusion rooms that they can use. Whereas if you look at the most recent hospitals, then only 39% of them have access to a seclusion room that they can use. So you can see quite clearly here from the historical record how it is that we have reduced our use of seclusion. What happens is when you have an older hospital and you change and you have a newer unit built, when the new unit is built, it's built without a seclusion room. Then when the nurses, the patients and staff move from the old hospital to the new hospital, the staff just have to find a way of managing without the seclusion, and they manage to do so. We're coming on to talking about the research that I've conducted a little bit more now. This chart represents questionnaires that were taken from over 1,000 patients and over 1,000 staff on our acute psychiatric wards, and the bars represent the degree of acceptability of different types of containment. So along the bottom you have different types of containment here. So here is intermittent observation, where the nurses go and check on the patients perhaps every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes, every 15 minutes. Through time out, is where a patient is asked to stay in their bedroom or other room on a kind of a consensual basis. The door is not locked. Through to PRN medication, constant observation, psychiatric intensive care, through to seclusion, and through to mechanical restraint. Okay. So this line here on this chart represents the line of acceptability. So anything above that line means that in the view of the staff or patients, it was to some degree acceptable, an acceptable practice, an acceptable thing to do. And anything below that line represents something that in the views of staff or patients was something unacceptable. The white bars represent the views of staff, and the black bars represent the views of patients. So first thing, fairly obvious thing that we can derive from this chart is that for all types of containment, almost, the staff think that they're very much more acceptable and good idea than do the patients. This is not entirely surprising. Some things are particularly popular with staff. Psychiatric intensive care would be one, and interestingly, intramuscular medication would be another, but there's a cluster there of fairly acceptable containment measures. Well, I want to draw your attention on this chart just to two things. Here, this is the bar representing seclusion, and here you have the staff clearly saying that they think seclusion is overall acceptable, but the patients are none too sure. That's very close to the line of acceptability there. So overall, patient opinion is about seclusion is, well, maybe, maybe not. If we then turn our eyes to mechanical restraint, which is not used in the UK, you can see that patients and staff both clearly consider that to be unacceptable. Interestingly, the staff consider that to be more unacceptable than do the patients themselves, but both groups are under that line of acceptability. If we look here, they look at it as being very similar to a caged bed. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a photograph of a caged bed. I haven't included one in this presentation. It's rather like an adult-sized cot for a baby. It's a bed and it's got a big caged net all around it, so effectively the patient is in a cage and is used in some parts of Eastern Europe and in Russia still today. So patients thought that was unacceptable, but they thought mechanical restraint was pretty close, next in line to that as being unacceptable. Okay, I want to talk to you about the results of the City 1 to 8 study. In this study, we looked at 136 acute psychiatric wards, and I've already presented you with some of the statistics from this study. On those 136 wards, for 6 months, the staff collected an end-of-shift report, something that we called a PCCSR, or Patient Staff Conflict Checklist. On that end-of-shift report, they ticked off the number of episodes of verbal abuse during the shift, the number of episodes of physical violence to others, the numbers of times that people had tried to abscond from the ward, the number of medication refusals, the uses of PRN medication, etc. So every shift, at the end of every shift, 6 months, 136 acute psychiatric wards. We had, at the end of this study, nearly 45,000 end-of-shift reports. And if you think about it, that covers about, pretty close to 70 years of acute ward time that we had in that study. We also collected from those 136 wards details of what type of patients were being admitted, what the service environment in the community was like, whether there were early intervention teams or assertive outreach teams or not, what the physical environment of the ward was like and what its quality was like, the ward routines, how much activities there were available for patients to do, the staffing numbers of all of the different disciplines, including the nurses, the attitudes of the staff, leadership, teamwork, burnout, and structure, and patient and staff attitudes to containment measures, as I have already presented to you. We then analysed what was associated with seclusion use. When you took everything, all of these different things into account, what things were associated with the use of seclusion on wards? Well, the number one thing that was associated with seclusion use on the wards was availability of a seclusion room. The more available your seclusion room and the closer it was to the ward, the more likely you were to use it. So if you didn't have the seclusion room, then you didn't do seclusion. If you didn't have the seclusion room on your ward, you were less likely to use it because you didn't have it to hand. Seclusion use was associated with aggression, with alcohol use, indicating that our seclusion was being used for the management of intoxicated patients, was associated curiously with absconding and with the refusal of medication. And it was also associated with other forms of containment. It was associated with rapid tranquilization or coerced intramuscular medication. That is because most patients are given an injection either at the time that they're in the seclusion room or just before they get there, quite often. was associated with being sent to psychiatric intensive care because in many of our acute wards, the seclusion room that is available is situated on the psychiatric intensive care unit. So if you have a disturbed patient on your ward and you want to give that disturbed patient or get that patient into seclusion, you have to take them to the psychiatric intensive care unit and transfer them there. And it was associated with constant special observation because practically all of our policies about seclusion mandate that the person must be constantly observed if they are in the seclusion room. So if you see a UK seclusion room with somebody in the seclusion, there will be a member of staff just outside the room keeping an eye on the patient, making sure they're safe, and trying to establish communication with them. As soon as you have reasonable communication with that patient, then they can come out of the seclusion room and rejoin the rest of the people on the ward. So clearly, seclusion also associated with show of force and manual restraint because that's what it takes to get a reluctant patient into the seclusion room. I wish I could tell you that when there were more qualified psychiatric nurses on duty, there was less seclusion. But in fact, it was the reverse. When you take all of these things into account, there was a slightly more seclusion going on when there were more qualified nurses on duty. Which means that we have to look inside at ourselves and the way that we are practicing. And also, use of seclusion was associated with a worse attitude towards difficult patients. So less enjoyment and more estrangement, more frustration, more sadness, and more sense of futility in dealing with patients mean that you will use more seclusion. Seclusion was not associated with a reduction in violence. If seclusion really worked in order to make your wards safer places, surely those wards that used lots of seclusion would be much safer. And there would be less aggression? Well, it's not the case. In fact, when you take into all of these things into account, there was no reduction in violence associated with the use of seclusion. That means that those wards that were not using any seclusion at all were no less safe than those wards that were using seclusion, when you took into account the type of patients who were being admitted, the staff numbers, and all of these other different variables. So, conclusions on seclusion so far. It's used rarely in the UK, doesn't make your acute ward any safer. The use is strongly facilitated by the provision of a special room for seclusion. It's pretty unpopular with patients, not really well loved by staff, but it's not as unpopular as giving intramuscular medication, which you can see our patients thought was worse. By just a bit. And it was used for intoxication, carrying risk. There are risks around seclusion, particularly around intoxication, because you can't monitor somebody's physical state while they're in the seclusion room terribly easily. And if you think that those patients have quite often also had intramuscular medication, then there's potential for depressed respiration and all kinds of other complications. And you can't see or monitor those things properly while somebody is behind a door. That's partly why we always have a nurse situated at the door of the seclusion room. I want to move on to talking about another research study now. I refer to this as the sequence study. In this study, we were interested in the order of conflict and containment events during the first 2 weeks of an admission. So we wanted to know what came first. And I'm going to talk only about those patients who were subject to seclusion in this presentation, and those who were subject to timeout. What I wanted to know in this particular analysis is what happened just before the seclusion. What happened at the beginning of the shift in which a seclusion took place? What happened to the patient just before the seclusion? What happened during the seclusion for the patient? And what happened once the seclusion was over? And my definition of seclusion for this was somebody was secluded if they were locked in a room by themselves, whether that was a special seclusion room or not. And the definition of timeout was somebody was asked to stay in a room, not necessarily their bedroom, it could be any other room by themselves, but without the door being locked. So the sample was acute psychiatric wards and psychiatric intensive care units, and it was a random sample of adult patients You can see some numbers here. Quite a lot of those patients, when we went to the ward, couldn't give us consent. The nurses said to us, you can't approach those patients because they're too ill and they cannot meaningfully consent to the study. So we have to stay away from 973. 407 people refused to give us consent because in this study we wanted to look at their case records. And people are very sensitive about the private information which is in their case records, and they were reluctant to give us access. But the final sample was 522 patients, and they were on 84 wards in 31 separate hospital locations. And it's been my privilege, as you can see, in the City 1 to 8 study and in this study, to do some really big pieces of research which are very illuminating for our understanding of what exactly is going on in psychiatry. So here we have these 522 patients on 84 different wards, and I was interested in those who were secluded or subject to timeout. Obviously, I can't go round to 522 patients in 31 different hospitals and 84 wards by myself. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. I'd still be carrying out this piece of research. I had lots and lots of help and lots of people working on this project, and here are some of the names. So this is what the data looked like when we finally put it together. What we did was we took all of those patients who were subject to seclusion and timeout, and we split the data into individual shifts for individual patients. So each row on this chart represents an individual shift for an individual patient in which there was a seclusion or a timeout. I'll just give you some examples. I'm just going to look at you won't be able to see the detail from there. Let's take this one. So this was a night shift for this individual patient. During the night shift, they came out of seclusion, so there was an end of seclusion. At the point at which they came out of seclusion, they were verbally violent to the staff, and they were given PRN medication, and then nothing happened for the rest of that shift. If we just pick another one, here's a long one. This was an afternoon shift during 2009 for this particular patient. They were aggressive to objects, so they were probably tossing the furniture around or something like that. The staff tried to de-escalate them. Clearly that appeared to fail because there was a start of seclusion, and the patient was still then trying to damage the stuff that was in the seclusion room, so still some aggression towards objects, probably kicking the door or something like that. The staff again were trying to de-escalate the patient while they were in seclusion, indicating that they were still there. They weren't kind of left there by themselves. Then there was an end of seclusion, so it would appear that that de-escalation worked, and a start of constant observation, and the person was placed on timeout. So probably what that meant was they were asked to stay in their bedroom for a while, and there was a nurse outside who was keeping an eye on things and watching what was going on. They were then given PRN medication, and nothing else happened for the rest of the shift. So now you understand the type of data that I was dealing with in this study. Please nod if you understand what I've got in my data. Okay, I can't see the people in the 15 different places to which it's being video conferenced, but I assume that you are all nodding. Okay, so our data was organised into patient shifts, and in this entirety of 522 patients, there were only 59 uses of seclusion, and that was for 37 patients. So this is 7.5% of patients across this entire study were secluded during the first 2 weeks of their admission. I think the comparable figure for here is, as I say, about 1 in 5. So you can see this is really quite different. 10 of those patients were secluded more than once during that first 2 weeks. There was much more use of timeout. So there were a lot of uses of timeout, and that was 81 different patients who were subject to timeout. The duration of seclusion, 28 or 53% of those episodes was less than 1 shift. So most of the time when somebody goes into seclusion, they're out again in the course of the same shift. It's less than an hour or 2. 38% of those episodes continued from 1 shift to another. And if you think about it, those were probably no more than a few hours either. Only 9% were longer than just 1 shift to another. and a few seclusions had no documented end points, so there wasn't any record. When we looked at the records and looked for precisely when the seclusion finished, it wasn't there. It was clear that it did finish, but nobody had actually documented precisely when the patient had come out of seclusion. Here we have a chart that represents what proportion of patients were secluded or subject to time out at the 31 different hospitals. Along the bottom here, you have each of the different 31 hospitals, and they've all got different numbers. The dark bars represent the proportion of patients at these hospitals who were secluded during the first 2 weeks of their admission. So here at this end, you can see there are a whole host of hospitals where nobody is secluded. And that's because, as I've already told you, there are many hospitals in the UK where there are no seclusion rooms and nobody is secluded. Then you've got a group of hospitals here where between 5 and 10% of patients are secluded, and we might think that that's probably within the realms of acceptable practice. Certainly we might consider that to be within the realms of acceptable practice in the UK. And I should reiterate that these were acute psychiatric wards and psychiatric intensive care units in this study, but not forensic hospitals and not specialty wards. So 5 to 10% of patients being secluded might be okay. But here we have at this end, we have some hospitals who were secluding up to 20% of patients or more. In fact, we have a few hospitals there who were secluding up to 25% of patients. So what this was telling me was that there are some hospitals in the UK where we have a real problem with the use of seclusion as well. And when we look at just our statistics on rates of seclusion, because we have all of these at one end of the scale where there's no seclusion going on at all, when you look at an average rate of seclusion of 7%, you think things are all right. Well, things are all right down here, but things are not all right here. And I've been spending a lot of time in the past year or two working with the organisations in government in the UK to try and get people to log, compare and present their use of seclusion data so that the people in these hospitals know that they are out of step with what is happening in the rest of the UK. Once somebody knows that they're out of step with other areas, then they can start making plans in order to change things. This chart has a lot of information, but if I can just concentrate your minds on this section here, what we did was look at the degree of violence that occurred prior to a seclusion taking place. What exactly was happening before the patient was placed in seclusion? What was the worst form of violence that happened before the patient was taken and placed in a seclusion room and locked by themselves? So in 29, nearly 30% of cases, so nearly a third of cases, there had been some physical violence before the seclusion took place. And you and I would probably agree, well, we might not like seclusion very much, but that's at least one way of managing a physically violent patient. But in 20% of cases, the only violence occurring before the seclusion took place was for a few chairs to be turned over, perhaps a door to be kicked, or somebody to bang on a window or otherwise try to damage objects. Even more surprising to me, there were 12% of cases of seclusion where the only thing that happened before the seclusion took place was a bit of verbal violence, people shouting or screaming or swearing. And even more surprising to me was this big 40% of cases where there was no violence at all before the seclusion took place. There's a whole list of different contexts of behavior and things that people were doing before the seclusion, but the bottom line here is we have to ask ourselves in the UK, is it justifiable for 40% of patients who are secluded to do no violence whatsoever before they are placed in the seclusion room? If we compare the two different interventions, on the one hand we have time out, where a patient is asked to stay perhaps in their bedroom by themselves with the door open or at least not locked, and they're being placed in a specific seclusion room where the door is locked and they're there by themselves. If we compare these two things, then time out is certainly used disproportionately for lesser forms of violence. In other words, if you're verbally aggressive in the UK, you're more likely to be asked to stay in your seclusion room than you are to be secluded. Similarly, if you are secluded, you're more likely to have been physically violent before that seclusion. So we would see this would probably be a correct, I don't know quite what the English word is, so I don't know how the translators are going to get on with this one. The correct apportionment, if you like, a correct set of thresholds in operation. That means less severe forms of containment were being used for less severe forms of behavior, and similarly the more severe containment for the more severe types of behavior. But what I then did was compare the efficacy of seclusion and time out for patients who were physically violent. Okay. So in this data set, we had some patients who were physically violent and were secluded, and we had some patients who were physically violent and were then subject to time out. Which of those two things was most effective? One way of saying whether a seclusion or a time out is effective or not is whether there is another episode of aggression after the time out or seclusion has happened. So if we're saying that seclusion is more effective at preventing a repetition of violence, it means that those patients who are placed in seclusion after a violent incident, there should be less second violent incident in those patients who are secluded than in those patients who are subject to time out for physical violence. And in fact, what this slide shows is that there is no difference. Right? Patients are just as likely to be physically violent again immediately after they have been secluded as they are if they are subject to time out. And that suggests that in those terms, the time out is just as effective as the seclusion. You might say to me, oh, that's all very well, but the patients who are subject to seclusion are probably different from those who are subject to time out. Well, if we look at the patient characteristics, the patients who are subject to seclusion in the UK, they're younger, they're more likely to have a history of drug use, and they're more likely to have a history of harm to others. But if you look at the patients who are subject to time out, compared to all of the other patients, they're also younger. They're also more likely to have a history of drug use, and also more likely to have a history of harm to others. So it's the same type of patients who are subject to both forms of intervention. So, conclusion so far, although seclusion is more frequently used for physical violence to others, the outcome of time out in these circumstances is just as good. Time out is used for the same sort of patients as seclusion. If you think back to that graph that I showed you of the patient and staff attitudes to different forms of containment, then patients and staff certainly approve of time out more than they approve of seclusion. And it's hard to resist the suggestion that some seclusion, certainly in use in the UK, may not be necessary, and I would suggest that that possibility also exists here. So there is scope for seclusion reduction in the UK, especially in some of those problem hospitals, and that seems to me to be fairly well proven. I'm going to talk a little bit more now about other people's research, not my research. We conducted a review of the literature on seclusion, and I want to tell you about two things that we found from that review of the literature on seclusion. The first was a review of seclusion reduction studies, and at the time that we did that review, there were 16 different published studies on seclusion reduction initiatives, and most of those were from the United States. That's because there has been a policy drive to reduce the use of seclusion and restraint in many different countries, primarily led by the United States, but also in the Netherlands, also in Australia, also in New Zealand, and also having some impact in the western parts of Canada now. So most of these studies were before and after studies that were evaluated by official records. That is, people instituted some change, and then they looked at their official statistics on seclusion use and were able to report whether there had been any difference or not. And most of those studies reported some kind of positive outcome, either a reduction in the numbers of seclusions or a reduction in the duration of seclusion. Sometimes both, but sometimes it was one or the other. And there were a couple of studies where there was no change, and there were a couple of studies where, in fact, they did an intervention and there was an increase in the use of seclusion and restraint. The patient populations were often not described or the changes monitored properly in these studies, and the rates and rate changes poorly described. So we don't know whether there were some changes in patient flow or patient composition between the before time and the after time in these studies, because these were generally conducted by people who were clinicians who were working in hospitals, who were working with official statistics that they had to hand. The type of interventions that people were using were things like new policies on the use of seclusion, changes in staffing patterns, staff training packages in the prevention and management of violence and aggression, special review procedures to use once seclusion had been instituted, typically mandating the review by a consultant psychiatrist within X number of hours, and a variety of different crisis management initiatives, including things like personal safety plans that I think are being experimented with here in this locality at the moment. Some of the improved outcomes in those studies were achieved by substituting seclusion with mechanical restraint or alternative forms of containment. So in other words, seclusion went down, but the use of coerced medication went up, etc. And although other outcomes were seldom measured well, overall there was no evidence that violence increased. So there were many studies where they achieved a reduction in seclusion with there being no increase in violent incident rates. And there's a little risk of publication bias here, because if I'm working at a hospital that has some initiative for the reduction of seclusion, and we do loads and loads of work with the staff and do training, and then we find out that we've not actually made any change, we're really less likely to write that up and submit it to a journal. If we do write it up and submit it to a journal, it's less likely that the journal will accept it, because it's not a very exciting paper, really. That means that the things you read in the scientific journals are often have some kind of bias. They make it look like interventions work better than they actually do. So the achievements in seclusion are probably less strong than the literature would give you to expect. Nevertheless, the picture is conveyed really quite clearly and convincingly that seclusion and restraint can be considerably reduced. And only last week I was in the psychiatric intensive care unit in a hospital in Winnipeg, and I was able to look at their clientele and their pictures and their records of restraint, and they went from a situation where almost 50% of their patients were subject to seclusion or restraint to one now where there is only a seclusion or a restraint perhaps every other month, if that, and they are hoping to get rid of those as well. So that's kind of demonstration, a Canadian demonstration, if you like, of what is within the realms of possibility. So that's seclusion reduction in the literature and in experience. If we look at patient feelings about seclusion in the literature review, we've got 25 studies that tell us how patients feel when they're in seclusion. And there's a little minority of patients that find it beneficial and like it, but the vast majority find it an extremely negative experience, in other words, a traumatizing experience. They feel angry, they feel abandoned, they feel very scared, humiliated, depressed, punished, claustrophobic, and sometimes, if they're in there for a long time, bored. What this is saying to me is that if you are going to do seclusion, if you're going to use seclusion in our hospitals, we should at least be giving people a high-quality seclusion experience. We should at least be caring for them while they're in seclusion. We're going to care for them while they're in seclusion. We should be trying to address these very normal emotional responses to being locked in a seclusion room. And if patients are feeling scared, angry, depressed, and horrified and abandoned in the seclusion rooms, then there are some easy nursing ways we can address those issues in terms of communicating with those patients, being with those patients, offering reassurance, being very respectful to them, giving them lots of information, telling them exactly how they have to behave in order to get out of the seclusion room, and getting them out of there as fast as possible. So clearly that has to be pushed through the barriers of psychosis and cognitive compromise. People who are extremely psychotic, it is very difficult to communicate with them, and yet there are ways of being with people who are with psychosis. There are ways of communicating well with people who are acutely psychotic, and I make a reference there to some package that you can download off the internet from my website, where we talk to about 30 expert nurses on how to communicate effectively with people who are acutely mentally ill. So if we're going to use seclusion, let's at least do it decently, properly, and in a high quality manner, rather than locking the door and forgetting about the patient and leaving them behind. Quite how your patients feel about being tied up in seclusion and then having the door locked on them, I don't know, but if it was me, I would be extraordinarily frightened. So, literature review conclusions. The outcomes of seclusion reduction initiatives could be measured much better. So, okay, if you're going to engage in this hospital or any of the other 15 sites where you're all listening to me on video conferencing, if you're going to do some initiative to reduce seclusion or seclusion and restraint in your hospitals, please do it as carefully as you can, do it as rigorously as you can, and make sure that you publish it and that you measure all the other potential outcomes as well. So make sure you know that if you're substituting one thing for another. Make sure that you're logging the number of violent incidents so that you can say confidently to other people that reducing seclusion doesn't increase your violent incidents, or does, whatever it is that you find. The outcomes of those interventions might be more modest than it first appears, or they might actually be a lot better than it first appears. That's only 16 studies. There's a lot more going on. Even since we did our literature review, there are many more studies in that field, and I certainly think there's lots more and we can do a lot better. It's all very well me calling for further research, and I certainly do call for further research, but that doesn't mean we can't take political action. And I would suggest one of the things that you can do if you want to reduce seclusion is close the rooms. Turn them into something else. Turn them into a storeroom. This is what I've seen people do, certainly seen them do this in British wards. Turn them into a storeroom, turn them into an ordinary bedroom, turn them into a sitting room, turn them into a comfort room with comfortable armchairs and some sensory displays and objects that people can feel, touch, handle, so that people can be reassured when they're agitated rather than being secluded. And if at the end of the day we have to use seclusion, and I think it's possible that there are some patients for whom we will always need some form of extreme containment measure. If we're going to do that, let's at least do it well and do it in a high quality manner, because seclusion includes much more than putting somebody in a room and locking the door. I just want to talk about a little visit I made to some of my local wards. This is actually a forensic hospital, a medium secure hospital. Some of the things that I saw there was we had a specialist ward here for mainly women with borderline personality disorder, and in the forensic hospitals these women are subject to, they do a lot of cutting, a lot of very nasty cutting, and it's very hard to stop them from harming themselves, and you have women there with extreme suicidality. If you turn your back for 1 minute, they'll be tying their clothes around their neck and strangling themselves. And all sorts. Sometimes we get stuck in the UK with such women. It's so difficult to manage them that they end up being on special observation on 1-to-1 care or even 2-to-1 care for a long, long time. And then every time you try and reduce that special observation, they will then behave and are suicidal again, and you have to reinstitute it. So it's a very difficult trap to get out of. And this particular ward, they were managing to get out of it with optional seclusion. So there was a few of the patients who were stuck in this pattern of behaviour. They got out of it by, at the patient's request, they were placed in seclusion in what we would call refractory wear, in clothing that couldn't be torn or used to harm yourself. And that meant that they could at least try to be away from other people or away from the instantaneous support or presence of other people without it being a potentially harmful environment. And they managed to get a few people out of that trap. So that was a therapeutic use of seclusion for me. Another thing I saw in that unit, which convinced me that there are some people for whom we're always going to need seclusion, is that there was one patient there who was repetitively trying to strangle other patients and the staff. Every time he came out of seclusion, he was acting so as to severely assault other people. And the ward there had a problem with that patient, but they managed it by placing the patient in seclusion, often for quite long periods of time. And I could not think of any other way of managing such a patient other than having seclusion to hand. But I would reiterate that that seclusion was what we would call in this hospital supervised confinement. Okay, the person was in a room and they were locked in a room by themselves, but they had a nurse outside the door who was watching and who was communicating with them the whole time. So, one of the questions you're going to have at this point is how do they do this in the UK? How is it that they don't use any mechanical restraint in the UK? And how is it that they have all of these 1/3 of hospitals that are not using any seclusion at all? Well, I don't know for sure, but this is some of how I think it might be done. So this is the role of nurses, first of all. And first of all, I think we just don't do it. And quite apart from what you think, there's actually no harmful outcomes when you don't do it. As soon as the patient has calmed down, you can withdraw any intervention, and there is no need for a seclusion. There is a widespread commitment in UK psychiatry to the principle of the least restrictive alternative. So we always do the least thing that we can do to contain somebody's behaviour. And quite often that least thing is usually some form of observation, maybe some form of intermittent observation to make sure that the patient concerned can't be harming themselves or somebody else, or some use of consensual medication, PRN medication. It might be that we're only using seclusion in the more severe cases, although even that is questionable when you see that there was that 40% of cases where seclusion was being used with no violence preceding it. But it might be still that we're only using it with the more severe cases. Or it might be that we make greater use of alternatives like time out, as I've already mentioned, PRN medication, coerced medication, having an extra care area or intensive care area on the ward. This is 1 or 2 rooms where the staff and the patients can go behind a locked door together. So you will go with a patient into a secure area and you will be able to talk to them and be present with them until they're ready to come back out on the ward and be with the other patients. Perhaps more use of psychiatric intensive care, which we would refer to as a locked ward with a higher staffing ratio. More use of observation. Potentially, we might be using more manual restraint than you. So we might actually be holding people and potentially holding people for longer periods of time than you would here, although we don't actually know that. If you take a British psychiatric nurse, or you take me, and I've had quite a bit of experience of working on wards. I've been a ward manager. I've worked on a psychiatric intensive care unit. I've managed an acute psychiatric ward. Yes, we do restrain people, but usually after you've been holding somebody for about 5 minutes, they're already starting to calm down. And most people are able, even if they can't actually negotiate, most people are willing to passively go along with you after about 5 or 10 minutes. I can't remember any occasion in my clinical experience where it's gone on for longer than about 10 or 15 minutes. It's always possible, and that might happen in some places at some times, but it would not be the general run of events. So maybe we're using more manual restraint, and maybe we're willing to use it for a little bit longer. And of course, during the manual restraint, we're negotiating with patients. And there is actually quite a lot of physical conversation during manual restraint. And I know a nurse who is doing research in the UK at the moment about physical contact during manual restraint. And she has been getting accounts from nurses where nurses will be stroking patients and stroking their faces and using physical contact to try and calm them when they're extremely agitated. I think that's very kind of a touching observation, and I'm looking forward to that research being published. Maybe there's a greater use of tolerance in UK psychiatry. Maybe we just don't react so much. Maybe we're willing to allow people to shout a little bit more. Maybe we're willing to allow them to toss the furniture about and then clear things up afterwards and talk to them afterwards, rather than going and grabbing them and placing them in seclusion straight away. Maybe we engage more in de-escalation and negotiation, debriefing, and maybe we're more willing to compromise with our patients. I don't know. I'm guessing because we don't know really what it is that we're doing in order to produce this situation. Maybe we're using greater prediction and prevention. And certainly there are many units in the UK that have invested in using either the Brusset violence checklist or the DASA, and I know that there's some work going on here with the DASA. Maybe that's better implemented in the UK. I'm not so sure, and if you want to ask me about that later, you can. I've got some reasons for that. Maybe it is that brutality begets brutality, and kindness begets kindness. Maybe you get stuck in a trap of using excessive means to control patients. If you use excessive means to control patients, then those patients are going to kick back and rebel eventually against those means, and that is going to re-justify you in using excessive means of containment. So you're kind of stuck in a trap or a cycle, and maybe those wards in the UK that are using 25% seclusion are stuck in that same kind of trap. The question that I have to ask myself, and maybe you have to ask yourselves as well, who's got the responsibility for stopping that kind of cycle? We certainly can't wait for the patients to tolerate what we do to them more. I think that becomes our responsibility to cut the cycle. So what am I suggesting to you? We close the rooms. Certainly we've closed the seclusion rooms and turned them into something else. What I would suggest to you is that you burn those belts that you're using, because quite clearly they are not necessary. If a whole psychiatric system in the UK can do without them, surely you can do without them as well. The role of psychiatrists. I interviewed 121 psychiatric nurses, and one of the questions that we talked about was their relationships with the medical profession and with doctors. These are the things that the nurses wanted from their consultant psychiatrists. How many psychiatrists in the audience here? Put your hands up. Oh, not so many. Okay, maybe there's a few more at the 15 different video conference centres. This is what our nurses expect from you. They want you to give an enthusiastic lead to treatment. They want you to respect nurses' roles in therapy. They want you to be present on the ward a lot. And they want you to genuinely confer with nurses and uphold the ward rules with them. They want you to share your expertise with them, and they want you to support nurses in resolving patient management problems. In addition, I would suggest to you that one of the things that you can do for us nurses is to act as guardians over the use of coercion. We're the people on the front line. We're the people who have to stand in front of a very, very angry and sometimes frightening patient who is making verbal threats to us and potentially picking up the furniture and shaking it in our faces. It is very difficult for us to maintain objectivity given what we are exposed to. It's very easy for us to, in our anxiety and sometimes in our frustration with patients, use containment where it might not be necessary. One of the things that you can do for us as psychiatrists is to come in from outside at a little bit of a distance and act as kind of guardians and let us know if you think that we're using containment too readily, too often, too much, or in the wrong circumstances. Another thing that you have the power to do is that you can insist on certain actions not being used. You can insist that for your patients you do not want X to happen. Or you can insist for all patients you don't want X to happen. Or you can put in your orders or say to us that you don't want us to do this in these circumstances, you want us to try or to do something else first. And I would ask you to do that for us. I would ask that you be on call to quickly review coercive methods. So one of the things that you might want to consider doing is that whenever one of your patients is placed in seclusion and mechanical restraint, that the nurses must call you, and you can then go down there and talk with the nurses about what's happened before and how you can get that person out of seclusion and mechanical restraint as soon as possible. You could order a fast cessation. You could tell us to let people out of the seclusion room if they've become relatively calm. And the last bit, all this containment business, that's something that belongs to us nurses. That's our fault. We're the ones taking the decisions and we're the ones that are using it. It's our responsibility. But if we don't do something about it, will you please, as consultant psychiatrists, be modern-day John Connolly's and Philip Pinnell's and William Tuke's and help us maintain things in balance? Some final conclusions, and then we'll get on to the questions. There is scope for seclusion reduction in the UK. We can substitute it with time out. We cannot use it at all in low-risk circumstances, and we could institute a no violence, no seclusion rule. That would get rid of nearly 50% of our seclusion. And stopping seclusion use doesn't make acute wards safer. I will say to you again, Quebec is one of the only places where seclusion and mechanical restraint is combined, and that has questionable justifiability. Why do you need to lock the door if the person is already tied up? If you're locking the door, why do you need to tie up the patient? I would say to you this is an extreme and possibly unnecessary measure, and it's certainly used excessively when you think of 20% of patients being subject to this type of containment. And some of those patients are left in that form of containment for a long time, a very long time, certainly longer than in some other places. This cannot be anything but stressful and frightening to patients, and I tell you, if you try to do it to me while I'm here, I'm going to get very, very aggressive, because it scares the heck out of me that that might be done to me. Research shows that seclusion use can be reduced. You can do it through managerial policy, training, managing your staffing, a review process, using alternatives. There's a long-term effort required, and it takes a lot of monitoring and sharing and comparing and targeted reduction strategies, but the provision of the rooms is also critical. And I'm suggesting to you again that if you have a lot of seclusion rooms, and I understand that you have, that you decommission some of them. And then we will find another way of managing. But seclusion can be sometimes necessary and sometimes used therapeutically. And if we're going to use seclusion, we should be using it properly and well. And we should also be making sure that it's safe, especially given that we're secluding and managing people who are either intoxicated or who have lots of psychotropic medication on board and in their system. So what am I saying to you? Seclusion, containment, it's not a black and white issue, as in this photo. It's not what I'm not coming to you and I'm not saying get rid of all seclusion and all containment and the world can be miraculous and wonderful. I'm not even telling you that we have wonderful psychiatry in the UK. We have loads of really poor psychiatry in the UK, and our wards are not nirvana, and in many ways they're not great, and in many ways our patients are not well cared for, and in some places it's not very good at all. So I'm not coming on that basis, but what I'm saying to you is that it's not a black and white issue with seclusion. It's much more of a variegated picture. It's much more of taking careful decisions and making sure that you try to minimize and yet still keep everybody as safe as possible. I'm going to leave it there, and now we perhaps have some discussion. Thank you very much.